She looked at me with that quiet, knowing smile, the kind that makes you wonder if everything happening between us had been her plan all along. I hadn't expected much when I walked up to her door that evening. It was supposed to be simple: drop off the groceries she'd asked me to pick up, maybe check on that squeaky cabinet hinge in her kitchen, and be on my way. Nothing about it felt unusual until she opened the door. Her smile was the first thing I noticed, warm and steady, but layered with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just a polite hello. It lingered, as though she had been waiting for me, as though she knew exactly how this night would unfold. And when her eyes met mine, it was impossible not to feel the weight of her attention, like she had quietly chosen me in that moment. She reached for the bags in my hands, her fingers brushing mine with a deliberate softness. "You didn't have to bring all this," she said, her voice low and colored with gratitude. But her hand didn't fall away immediately. Instead, it pressed lightly against my arm, guiding me inside. That small gesture carried a warmth that stayed long after she let go. The house was quiet, except for the hum of a lamp and the faint rustle of curtains moving with the evening breeze. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sweet baking in the oven. I remember noticing how the light caught her hair, throwing soft highlights across her shoulders as she moved ahead of me. She carried herself with the kind of ease that only comes with time, yet every movement seemed intentional. I obeyed without question, the sound of paper bags against wood echoing in the stillness. When I straightened, she was closer than I expected. Too close, maybe. Close enough for me to notice the faintest trace of her perfume. Something floral yet grounded, like jasmine carried on warm air. For a moment, neither of us moved. Her eyes searched mine, unhurried and unafraid, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I had told myself this was just a neighborly errand, an act of kindness. But standing there in the glow of her kitchen light, with her presence wrapping itself around me, it didn't feel casual anymore. She broke the silence with a laugh, soft and disarming, before brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You're always so helpful," she said. Yet the way she said it didn't sound like simple gratitude. It sounded like an acknowledgement of something unspoken, something she had been waiting for me to notice. And in that moment, I couldn't shake the thought. The way she welcomed me, the way she smiled, it felt like this had all been planned from the very beginning. I never thought sitting in her living room would feel this natural. At first, I told myself it was just a short visit. Bring the groceries, fix what needed fixing, and leave before it grew late. But somehow, the rhythm of the evening carried me further in. She set out 2 glasses, poured something amber and smooth, and gestured for me to sit. It wasn't a request. It was as though she had already made room for me in her world. The couch felt too soft beneath me, like it was trying to pull me into comfort I wasn't sure I was ready for. She settled beside me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. There was a flickering lamp on the table, its shade casting a golden glow that softened every edge of her face. It almost made me forget where I was or why I had come. We started with small talk, the kind of safe words people use when they're finding their way towards something deeper. But quickly, the conversation shifted. She leaned in whenever she spoke, her laughter quiet and low, the kind that doesn't need an audience to feel genuine. I found myself telling her about things I usually keep tucked away, my uncertainties, the way the future sometimes feels like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady on mine, her presence like a balm against the restless noise in my head. When she spoke of her own life, her words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. She told me about dreams that never quite came to be, about paths she didn't take, and the lessons those choices had carved into her. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance. Yet, beneath it all, I sensed a longing for connection, for being understood, for someone to simply sit beside her and hear her story. At one point, she shifted slightly, her knee brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, so easily dismissed as accidental, but she didn't move away. If anything, she let it remain, a silent tether holding me in place. I felt the heat of that touch more than I wanted to admit. Her hands fascinated me. They weren't idle. They moved with purpose even in stillness. As she spoke, her fingers traced the rim of her glass, pausing only when she looked at me, her gaze lingering longer than it needed to. That simple motion, combined with her nearness, pulled me into a space where time seemed to slow. I tried to act composed, to match her calm, but inside I felt caught between the safety of friendship and the edge of something far more dangerous. Every laugh, every glance, every brush of her knee seemed to carry an invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. And yet, as the minutes passed, I realized I wasn't looking for excuses to leave anymore. I was searching for reasons to stay. There was a moment when our conversation shifted, so subtly I almost didn't catch it. One second we were laughing about something ordinary. The next she tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with quiet intent. She set her glass down, folded her hands loosely in her lap, and asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. It wasn't about work or studies or the usual small talk. It was about me, about my choices, about why I always seemed to hold back when it came to certain parts of my life. Her words were soft, but precise, like she'd been watching me longer than I realized, and tonight she was finally ready to press gently on the places I'd kept hidden. I remember freezing for just a breath too long. The silence stretched between us, and in that space I could hear the faint tick of a clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own pulse quickening. She didn't look away, didn't rescue me from the weight of the question. Instead, she leaned in just a little, her shoulder brushing mine, her presence urging me toward honesty. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to give her the easy answer, something harmless and forgettable. But the way she looked at me, steady, patient, expectant, made it impossible. It was as if she already knew the truth, and all she needed was to see whether I would trust her enough to give it voice. I started, my throat suddenly dry. I guess I'm afraid of choosing wrong, of wanting something too much, only to find out I wasn't meant to have it. Her lips curved, not into a smirk, not into pity, but into something gentler, an understanding smile that seemed to reach straight into me. For a moment, I swore she was proud of me for admitting it, even if my words felt clumsy. She shifted again, closer this time. The fabric of her sleeve brushed lightly against my arm, and her hand rested on the couch just inches from mine. She didn't touch me outright, but her presence was unmistakable. My skin burned with the nearness of her fingers. "That doesn't sound like fear," she said softly. "That sounds like someone who knows the difference between what is ordinary and what is worth risking everything for." Her words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. I didn't know whether she meant them as advice, as comfort, or as something else entirely. But the smile she gave me, quiet, knowing, almost mischievous, told me that maybe she was testing more than just my honesty. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't simply listening to me. She was drawing me out, piece by piece, as though she wanted me to see myself the way she already did. The moment came without warning, disguised as something ordinary. She reached across the small space between us to hand me a book she'd been talking about, her voice soft with excitement as she explained why it mattered to her. I reached out, ready to take it, and that's when her hand brushed against mine. It should have been nothing, just the passing of an object from one person to another. But she didn't pull away. Her fingers stayed against mine, light but certain, like she wanted me to feel the weight of her presence more than the weight of the book. The touch was simple, yet it stole the air from my lungs. Her skin was warm, steady, and the contact sparked a quiet rush through me that I couldn't disguise. My heart thudded, my breath caught, and suddenly the room felt smaller. The lamplight glowed softer, the clock ticked slower, and the space between us collapsed into a single point where our hands met. I looked up at her, searching for an explanation in her face, but she only smiled. Not a playful smile, not teasing, but something deeper, a calm acknowledgement of what had just passed between us. Her eyes lingered on mine, unhurried, as if daring me to look away first. I couldn't. Her thumb moved then, the faintest graze across the back of my hand, so slight I wondered if she even realized she was doing it. But I knew. Every nerve in me knew. That tiny motion carried more meaning than any word she could have spoken. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything to break the silence. But my voice felt trapped in my chest, weighed down by the intensity of her closeness. All I could do was sit there, my hand half claimed by hers, caught between wanting to lean into the moment and fearing what it meant if I did. When she finally drew her hand back, it wasn't abrupt. It was slow, deliberate, her fingertips trailing against my skin like she wanted to leave a trace behind. And she did. The warmth stayed long after she pulled away, echoing through me with every beat of my heart. She turned her attention back to the book, speaking casually again, as if nothing had happened. But her voice carried a different tone now, softer, almost intimate, like we were sharing a secret no one else could see. I tried to steady myself, to pretend the moment hadn't unraveled me. Yet every time I shifted, I could still feel her touch imprinted on my hand, a silent reminder that our evening had crossed an invisible line. And though I told myself not to read too much into it, the truth was undeniable. It wasn't just a brush of fingers. It was a signal, quiet and deliberate, telling me I was exactly where she wanted me to be. The laughter that had filled the room just minutes before softened into something quieter, something fragile. She leaned back against the couch, her glass resting untouched in her hands, and for the first time that evening, her eyes dropped away from mine. "I don't usually talk about this," she began, her voice carrying a tremor so slight I almost missed it. "Most people don't really want to hear it anyway." I waited, saying nothing, afraid that if I rushed her, the moment would dissolve. Her fingers traced circles along the rim of her glass before she set it down altogether, folding her arms across herself in a gesture that seemed both protective and uncharacteristically small. "There are nights," she continued, "when the house feels too big, too quiet. You start to wonder if anyone even notices when you're not around." She gave a half smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And sometimes you realize how long it's been since anyone's really looked at you, not just seen you, but looked, as if you matter." Her words sank into me, heavy and unadorned, and I felt something stir in my chest. I wanted to tell her she mattered, that anyone who had ever sat with her, spoken with her, couldn't possibly think otherwise. But the ache in her voice held me still. This wasn't the time for reassurances. It was a time to listen. The lamplight flickered against the curve of her face. Catching the sheen of unshed tears, she quickly blinked away. Instinctively, I moved closer, my body acting before my mind could catch up. My hand hovered for a moment before I let it rest gently on her forearm. The warmth of her skin was immediate, and though she stiffened slightly at first, she didn't pull away. "You don't have to hide that," I said softly. "Not with me." She turned then, her eyes meeting mine, and the vulnerability there nearly unraveled me. I had always seen her as composed, graceful, someone who carried herself with unshakable steadiness. But here she was, allowing me to glimpse the cracks she usually kept hidden. And instead of weakening her, it made her more real, more human, more impossible not to care for. She exhaled slowly, the sound trembling as it left her. Then, almost without thinking, she leaned into me. Her head came to rest lightly against my shoulder, her hair brushing against my jaw. I froze for a heartbeat, stunned by the weight of trust in that gesture. Then I let myself relax into it, my hand shifting just enough to cover hers where it rested on her lap. Her fingers curled instinctively around mine, not tight, but enough to say she wanted me there. In that silence, broken only by the faint hum of the world outside, I could feel the rhythm of her breathing against me, steadying with every passing moment. And I realized then, this wasn't just her letting me see her pain. This was her choosing me in the smallest, quietest way possible. Silence had never felt so alive. After her confession, after the weight of her leaning into me, the room seemed to wrap itself around us like a secret we were both guarding. The lamplight glowed steady, the shadows soft against the walls, and the world outside faded into nothing. Her head still rested lightly against my shoulder, and I didn't dare move. Every breath I took rose and fell beneath her, every heartbeat a drum I feared she could hear. My hand, still holding hers, became the anchor between us. Warmth pressed to warmth, steady and undeniable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The quiet said more than words could. Her fingers shifted just slightly, brushing against mine as though testing whether I was still there. I answered without hesitation, letting my hand lace more firmly with hers. The fit felt natural, like it had always been waiting for this moment. When I finally looked at her, she lifted her head just enough to meet my gaze. Her eyes held no trace of the earlier fragility. Instead, they were calm, assured, as though she knew exactly what she was offering and what she was asking in return. For a heartbeat, I thought about all the reasons to step back, the differences between us, the questions that would follow, the weight of what people might say. But none of it mattered under her gaze. She wasn't asking for promises or explanations. She was asking for presence, for acknowledgement, for the courage to let the unspoken truth between us live in the open. I squeezed her hand lightly, and that was all it took. A faint smile curved her lips, soft and knowing. She leaned just a little closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and together we let the silence hold us. The clock ticked faintly in the background, marking the passing minutes, but time no longer felt linear. It stretched, slowed, folded in on itself. Every shift of her body against mine, every breath we shared, felt eternal. I studied her profile in the warm light. The graceful lines of her face, the way her lashes cast delicate shadows, the steadiness in her expression. There was no rush in her, no demand, just quiet certainty, as if she had been patient enough to wait for me to arrive here, in this moment, on my own terms. And I realized then that she had been guiding this evening with the gentlest of hands, not pushing, not forcing, but opening doors one by one until I chose to step through. It wasn't manipulation. It was invitation. I leaned back against the couch, letting the weight of her against me feel less like a question and more like an answer. And when her thumb brushed softly against the back of my hand again, I understood. This was not an accident, not a fleeting comfort. This was us, choosing the closeness neither of us had dared to name, until now. Eventually, the night began to settle into its natural end. The clock's hands had crept forward without my noticing, and the quiet hum of the house reminded me it was later than I intended to stay. Still, I found myself reluctant to move, afraid that standing up would break the fragile magic of what we had created together. She seemed to sense my hesitation. When I finally shifted, preparing to leave, she didn't protest. Instead, she watched me carefully, as though memorizing the way I gathered my things, the way I lingered by the edge of the couch. There was no urgency in her, only calm acceptance, as if she knew this moment wasn't a goodbye, but a beginning. I stood, and she rose with me. For a second, we simply faced each other in the dim lamplight, neither speaking, both unwilling to sever the silence that had become its own kind of language. Then, almost instinctively, I reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. My hand lingered longer than it should have, cupping the side of her face. Her skin was warm beneath my palm, softer than I'd imagined, and she leaned into the touch without hesitation. That small act undid me. It wasn't dramatic or rehearsed. It was quiet, unspoken, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said aloud. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady and sure, and I felt her breathe against my wrist. The world outside could have fallen away, and I wouldn't have noticed. And then she smiled. Not the casual smile she had given when I first arrived, nor the guarded one she used when telling stories she didn't want to admit hurt her. This smile was different, calm, certain, almost secretive. The kind of smile that told me she had been leading me here, step by step, not with manipulation, but with patience. Like she had seen this moment long before I had, and was simply waiting for me to catch up. It struck me then, this wasn't chance. This wasn't an accident born from late-night conversation and shared silences. She had opened the door, invited me into her world, giving me every opportunity to turn away. And still, here we were. I let my thumb trace gently along her cheek before lowering my hand, though every part of me wanted to keep holding on. She didn't stop me. She only kept smiling, that same knowing curve of her lips that left me both unsettled and deeply grounded. When I finally stepped toward the door, she followed, not out of formality, but because she wanted to walk me there. The cool night air greeted me as she opened it, but the warmth of her presence stayed with me, anchored in the imprint of her hand and that unforgettable smile. As I stepped outside, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of a simple evening. It was the quiet beginning of something neither of us could pretend away.